Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Brian Pompeii from the Department of Geography and Earth Science. Welcome to today's session. There'll be two speakers today. Myself, who will present second on issues of California water and injustice, precluded by Dr. Daniel Sambu, also in the Department of Geography and Earth Science. But before we begin, I would like to read from UWL's Indigenous Land Recognition Statement. We would like to recognize that the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse occupies the land of the Ho-Chunk people. Please take a moment to celebrate and honor this ancestral Ho-Chunk land and the sacred lands of all indigenous peoples. Thank you. So just a couple words on the format of this is Dr. Sambu will give his presentation for about 25 to 30 minutes, and we'll take times for questions, and then we'll do the same for myself. So I would now like to introduce Dr. Daniel Sambu in his talk on wildlife conservation and social justice.
Okay, thank you very much, and welcome to this talk. This is an ongoing research that I and a few students have participated in Tanzania. And while doing the study abroad program with the students, we've visited several villages. And some of these villages are the ones that I'm going to highlight and try to show the link between conservation and wildlife conservation. And there seem to be a lot of benefits between communities and conservation program. And also there's quite some conflicts that also occur in the process of conservation. Now let's see if this is going to work. Looks like it's. Try and see if it will work over there. We have a technical issue.
You can just like click the screen with the mouse. Click it once, and then you try to use the.
Oh, okay.
That work.
So there's a trick to it. Okay, so the communities that I'm going to talk about are the Maasai, we have the Hata, we have the Tataga, and then I will briefly talk about the impact of conservation programs on the livelihoods of those communities, especially the creation of national parks and what we call the community conservation efforts. So we will talk about the Maasai. Maasai are pastoralist communities. And it's one of the indigenous groups in Kenya and Tanzania who still maintain their traditional lifestyle of moving from one region to another in search of pasture and water following the climatic conditions that change over time. Because of these climatic conditions that is punctuated by frequent droughts, these communities have adapted a lifestyle that allows them to survive this very harsh condition. These communities too live in a place where it's a biodiverse ecosystem where we have a lot of wildlife. So when you hear people going to East Africa for safari, that probably they will end up in Maasai Mara in Kenya or Serengeti in Kenya. Those are places where the Maasai are found. And their staple food is mainly milk and meat, occasionally some blood mixed with meat. So when we go to these communities, this is a village in Anoka Village. It is in Ngorongoro crater. So they're inside the depression And this community used to be in Serengeti. Many of us know the Serengeti, the major Serengeti. So prior to Serengeti being converted into a national park, the Maasai used to live in that area. And in 1949, they were forcefully evicted from that region, and they settled in villages in Ngorongoro. And one of the villages that is our case study is Anoka Village. So this is a community where a new form of conservation is being tried out, human wildlife conservation. Actually, it's not new, it's a very old. They are trying to reintroduce the old way of wildlife conservation, where communities and wildlife mingle together and live together, and see if this is allowed to, as a major conservation method, whether that will help in reducing the rate of species extinction, which is very high at the moment. So if you go to this village, you travel, meet communities, you get wildlife, see wildlife, and also see domesticated animals all mixed up in one ecosystem. And as you can see this close up too, where wildlife as well as domestic animals are living together. So when this is a group of students, a few years ago, we met with the community, and during this session, the community's leaders in the community were explaining to our students some of the challenges that they are facing and some of the benefits they're actually getting from participating in conservation in this region. So these are the Maasai. Another group of the second group is what we call the Hata. So when we talk about hunter and gatherer communities, usually we think that was a very old kind of lifestyle, but actually it's still in existence in Tanzania. And we have this community called the Hata. And these communities, they live in makeshift houses, as you can see, because they keep moving from one place to another. So when we go there with students, we have to travel a lot trying to figure out where they are. But we usually have informers who tell us where these people are. You can see how they live. This is their bed. It's just a skin. And these people also, their lifestyle and livelihood has been affected by conservation in many ways. So when we go there, we meet these people. As you can see, they use traditional methods of hunting to get their kill. And when we went there one time, we found this guy had killed a very big bird. Okay. So one of the biggest things that faces this community is that when conservation areas were carved out of their hunting grounds, their ability to get food has been really limited. They usually hunt antelopes and big animals, but then now they can't get, they told us they can't get any of those animals now. They have to rely on birds mainly and small animals. So life for them is becoming a little bit tricky. One biggest problem, lamentation that they have is the fact that when we have tourists there are going to their region, tourists can get a permit to hunt, to kill these big animals. But then if they kill the big animals, they go to jail for quite a while. And it becomes a real kind of injustice when they see people coming from other regions hunting, but for them they are not allowed to hunt in the conservation areas. So it is a challenge. So whenever we go there, these are our students, we actually accompany them in the hunting. They are hunting, And after that, before that, they train us on how to use some of their weapons. So these weapons, they look simple, but actually we tried, and it's kind of very hard to use them. We tried, but we were not very successful. But it was fun for us and for our students to try, go hunting and practice and see what these communities do. Another community is what we call the Tataga. This is agro-pastoralist communities. So it was initially it was a pastoralist community like the Maasai. They were also kicked out of the Serengeti to the area where they live now. And then when they introduced community conservation, they were again kicked to another area because the conservation in that region could not accommodate pastoralism as a lifestyle. So this picture actually tells a lot. Usually they tell us if they were still doing what they used to do traditionally, most of these guards will be full of milk. But as you can see now, they told us for quite a while now they don't have enough milk, so most of their guards are hung at the top of their roofs. So getting food becomes an issue. So it was because of that now they started practicing a little bit of agriculture, growing corn and millet. And you can see here, they still use the traditional way of grinding the corn to get flour. Our students tried that too. It wasn't very easy. We tried, but eventually we managed to grind a few cups of corn with our students. Okay. So when fortress conservation, that is a model of conservation through national park that was actually modeled from Yellowstone here in the US, and many parts of the region were carved into national parks. So we have the Serengeti, the big one, we have Maasai Mara, the big one too, and then we have other small ones, and then communities in between. So all those national parks don't allow any human activity except for research and tourism. So the idea was the government will get money and some of the money will go to these communities, but the communities are really not getting much money from the government. So when we go there, this is our car, we pay some money, but the community said they just get a very small fraction out of it. So because of all these conservation programs now, before that, most of these conservation areas took out the most lucrative areas of land that the community used for survival, especially watering points, the rivers, and areas that have a lot of pasture and grass. So a lot of those areas were carved, and communities currently find it very hard to access water and pasture. And their migration routes for pastoralists have been blocked, and that way of lifestyle has been curtailed. And as a result of that, these communities are facing a lot of issues. As you can see from this bar chart, lack of social services like education, healthcare is a real problem. When we went there, most of their students, kids, are actually at home because they don't have enough schools to attend. Water has become a very big issue. We have human-wildlife conflicts. Every time we go there, these communities have stories about, for example, elephants coming to their community and destroying crops. The last time lions came to their villages and killed sheep and goats. And when that happens, actually, the community is not allowed to kill those lions and because they are protected and they are threatened, they are almost endangered and probably might be extinct. So the law really protects them. But then there's now a conflict when these animals come and kill communities' wildlife, and then communities are not supposed to retaliate. And the communities, they are supposed to be compensated for the lost animals. But then the government doesn't do that. So there's a lot of social and injustice issues happening right there. So because of that, communities have also resorted to some illegal activities as kind of a retaliation. For example, charcoal burning. We have invasions, so communities just breaking into national park. Like right here, they go in there and graze their animals in the national parks. So invasions have become very frequent. And the communities complain once they do this, there's always penalties when they do that. And they mine sand, which is illegal, and sometimes they set fire on the park just because they want to retaliate. And big problem is poaching, especially for elephant and rhinos. And people wonder how that happens when there are big communities living all over, but that is because communities really, because of all these problems, they don't really care about poaching. If somebody from somewhere can kill a lion for them, that is a plus. So there's been still a problem of trying to reconcile conservation and community livelihood to a point where the two of them will work well for everybody. Okay. So recently, another method of conservation was proposed that tried to address the issues of national parks, and that is community conservation. So several conservancies have been established, and this is a situation where communities are asked to put together their land and then convert that land into a conservation area and to protect the wildlife in their neighborhood. And the idea was to try and solicit community support, communities who are very hostile to conservation. And the only way to help and bring them into conservation is to make them part of the conservation effort. And in return, they try to earn a living out of maybe tourism. Okay? So they were asked that if you convert your land for conservation, the government will help them build tourist lodges. So whenever we go there with our students, we stay in some of these tourist lodges and we pay money, and some of it goes to the community. We also visit communities who sell jewelry, as you can see right here, our students doing that. And from that, the community can sell the jewelry to tourists and pay some money. And then with all that, what they can get from here, they can actually have something like a collateral that they can get a credit, microcredit that they can invest in other things. So because of this initiative, a lot of things have happened. Some money have been found that can fund social services. We have also government and NGOs that supply communities with what we call relief water, because that place is very dry and people don't have enough water to drink. So there's always relief water where cars and tankers actually ferry water to communities. Some money has been invested in school and health clinic and also security. So these are some of the benefits for these community conservancies. The government also tried to encourage farmers to sell their livestock through a certain format where the government comes in and they buy livestock so that farmers can get money from their livestock instead of driving them. They usually drive their cattle themselves very far, maybe 100 miles, to try and get a market for livestock. But then the government now would come with trucks and buy livestock from communities, and that became an advantage. But then there's still issues even after communities and conservation or community conservation was established. Okay, so we still have issues related to community versus conservation. There is a big feeling that the conservation still pits communities against wildlife. So the perception is still very negative in these communities. We have private conservancies where private individuals own land, big chunks of land. There's been news recently about communities in Ngorongoro and the fact that they want to be kicked out, the government want to kick them out. And one of the reason that they want to be kicked out is there is an investor from Middle East who would like to buy a big chunk of that area and convert it into a private conservancy. And there are quite a number of those private conservancies alongside community conservancies. And communities usually have a lot of conflict between these groups because that land usually initially belonged to these communities. Okay. Human-wildlife conflict is still a big thing. Animals destroying not only crops but actually killing members of the community. Okay. And then we have what we call community ranchers, those communities that refuse to convert their land into a conservancy and instead they keep animals. So there is a conflict between that too. And then another thing that is really a problem for conservation in general is fences that are all over, especially at watering points, that makes it very hard for animals, especially the wild animals migrating from one region to another, which is supposed to happen. So things like the Great Migration usually faces a lot of challenges when they get barriers like this. And this also created another issue where we have a situation where creation of these community conservancies made some people rich and some people poor. So there is a sense of unfairness. We have communities that contributed a big land versus communities that contribute a smaller land. But when tourist revenues are shared, they are shared equally among everybody. So that seems to be quite unfair. And there is a lot of complaints about that. Okay. And then, of course, conflict when these communities who are very poor are not able to pay fines, and then eventually many members of the community end up in jail for quite a while. Okay. And then traditionally we have communities, different communities sharing resources and using traditional laws. So they have rules of access, but when we have other communities coming from other regions, there are rules that allows them to access water and pasture. But with these new conservation models, those traditional laws were kind of discarded. And when these other communities come to this region trying to access water or pasture, they are not allowed, and therefore conflicts emanate. So there's always a lot of physical conflict, and there's also a lot of death, people killing each other because of this. So in a nutshell, we still don't have a balance between conservation and community livelihood. Can the two be done concurrently, where we reduce the rate of extinction, which is accelerating at a high rate in this region, while at the same time ensuring that communities don't continue staying in that cycle of poverty, perpetual cycle of poverty. Okay, because if the communities are not happy, if the communities are poor, then conservation might not succeed. Okay. All right. Any question? Yes.
I read a story one time about like these big game hunters, particularly this one was from Dallas, who paid a lot of money for a ticket to go in an auction to kill a rhino, which are an endangered species. And the idea was that this book I was reading was trying to tell you why this is a good thing, and this isn't what I believe. But it was saying that in this particular rhino herd, that there was this very old male rhino that would kill new baby rhinos that were born. And so the conservancy, the community conservancy, would actually get a lot of the money from like, so this was like a famous story about this dentist in Dallas or something, if you remember the story. Paid like a lot of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars to go kill this rhino. So when you went there, they said, that's the only one you can kill, that, you know, that they're going on the safari. So they were trying to pitch this as that these, you know, because I would often think this is like a type of like neo-colonialization of, you know, of white people going there to kill these big animals. But in that story, I was wondering if that's something that's going on in these communities as well. Is there any way that type of conservancy, that hunting conservancy, could be beneficial for some of these endangered species, or no? Is that sort of a fallacy?
Yeah, currently Tanzania still allows hunting. So if you are rich and you can pay, you can actually buy a license to go and hunt some of the species that are categorized as threatened, like elephants. So, and of course, there's all arguments, as you say, as to how that can help in protection of wildlife. But really, usually, that money doesn't really get into communities. Usually, it ends up somewhere. It doesn't get to where conservation actually takes place. And that is a big problem. And when you allow one person to come and kill an elephant, it becomes very easy to do the same thing for many others. And so it encourages continuous killing. Yeah. So we have several countries, some countries like Kenya, that has been disallowed. We have countries in Southern Africa that still allow some kind of hunting. But the biggest complaint from communities is, why can't we hunt? We need to hunt for food. And these people are hunting for fun. And they're allowed to do that. Any other question?
Question. I'm going to walk around with the microphone just so that we can pick it up for our virtual viewers as well.
How well has the community conservation been utilized? Are a lot of the national parks or these conservancies utilizing that? Or are there still some national parks that are kind of in an older model?
You say, if I get your question, you say how long has the conservation in general?
I guess you talked about like the community conservation as like a new way for national parks to operate. I guess I'm curious how well that's been taken up, and are a lot of national parks utilizing that?
Yeah, conservation, despite the fact that I say it's a new model of conservation, actually, it's been there since 2000. So the community that we usually go, that conservancy was started in 2006. And that is where our research is really based on. So it's new, but not very new. So we are now starting to see the benefits as well as the challenges. And a lot of challenges carry over from the national park system.
You mentioned a lot of the money not getting to the communities. Does it just get stuck in government corruption, or how does that work? Like how is it not getting back to those communities?
Yes, one of the biggest things, One is corruption, for sure, where the money just ends up in a lot of administrative things that it's hard to explain. And another thing is just like the division of revenue is quite unfair, because these communities say, despite the fact that they have been allowed to run some of these conservancies, animals or the wildlife is actually still legally owned by governments. So when a tourist comes and pays, the community gets, I think it was 25%, and then the rest, 75%, goes back to the government. So that money is very, very little. So actually the communities were telling us the only way they get money is when they sell their stuff directly to the tourists. But the money they get from government is very little.
Thank you.
Maybe one more before Dr. Brian comes. So another thing, another research that we are embarking on is the impact of, you can imagine the impact of these community conservancies, the impact of COVID. Now the disease shut off completely tourists, and the survival of this, or the rationale for these conservancies were actually based on commercialization of nature, where they will benefit based on money that comes from tourists. Now, for the last 2 years, not a single tourist has gone to these conservancies. All the hotels that we used to travel and visit are closed, and these people haven't sold anything. They're telling me they haven't sold anything, and many businesses associated with tourists or communities actually have closed. And now they're hoping tourists will start coming, which we don't know when. So that's another layer of problems.
Get mic'd up here so people online can hear us. All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Brian Pompeii from the Department of Geography and Earth Science. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the social production of drought in California, particularly during this era from about 2016 to 2018, which has been coined the Great California Drought. This research is positioned within, I want to frame this within our topic of discussion today of social injustice. So my work is focused in hazards, particularly how in times of hazards, hazards tend to magnify already existing social and environmental inequalities. So a textbook example of this would be something like Hurricane Katrina. So that was a hazard, and what that did is it magnified already existing social and environmental inequalities. If you were to map that, the areas that were the worst off were areas that were already suffering from a decrease of support or tax dollars, et cetera. So I'm applying these same methods and framework to studying drought in California. So for those of you that might not be too familiar with this region, during around 2015, the physical conditions of the drought were they were receiving record lows. When I say record lows, I'm talking about the last 2,000 years, record lows of precipitation, record lows of snowpack in the Sierra Nevadas, which feed the stream flow of the Central Valley of California here. So stream flow of the 4 major rivers were at their lowest. That's the physical conditions of the drought. What I would like to do today is present the social conditions of the drought, what led to the drought being so severe for certain groups of people, and particularly how individuals cope, so what happens in your household when you run out of water, and how institutions responded to this hazard. And we're mostly working in the San Joaquin Valley here. For those of you not familiar with California, this is one of the most agriculturally productive regions in the world. This whole valley would be called the Central Valley, and this southern part is the San Joaquin Valley. Now, this is a very dry area. It regularly receives about 11 inches of rain per year. I think La Crosse gets like 48 inches, just to put that into perspective. So historically, when farmers didn't have access to water, they would do one of two things. They would rely on surface water, like lakes and streams, and then they would turn to the ground in the form of groundwater. So if you're not familiar with this lake right here, Tulare Lake, this was once the largest freshwater lake west of the Mississippi. And you might be asking yourself, well, I've never heard of that lake, or I've been to California, or I've never seen that massive lake on a map. That's because as of 1899, it was completely overdraft, completely dry, and it remained dry since 1899. It no longer exists. It is now farmland on the kind of the border of these two counties, Kings County and Tulare County, that we're going to be talking about today. So once you use up all of your surface water resources, you turn towards the ground. This is a famous image by the USGS of a engineer holding up a sign showing land subsidence. So at the very top of this telephone tower, you would see a sign that says 1925, and at the bottom is 1977. So because they're removing groundwater, the land is actually sinking. It has sunk over in some places in San Joaquin Valley 150 feet. So this, amongst other things, has led the USGS, which is the United States Geologic Survey, to call this area the most human transformed region in the world. The most human transformed region in the world, because they've transformed their air, their earth, their water, and their flora and fauna, their biology, have completely been rearranged by engineering, by moving around of water and the crops that are growing there. So in an effort to increase, so once groundwater begins to be a problem, as you have to dig deeper and deeper for groundwater, the Bureau of Reclamation created the Central Valley Project, which it's a very complicated project by the United States Bureau of Reclamation, but the major goal is it's a series of canals and aqueducts that seeks to bring water from the generally wetter north of California to the generally drier south. That's all we need to know for this. And in the 1950s, they completed this Frank Kern Canal, and this is what I want to focus on here. The Frank Kern Canal diverts the San Joaquin River, which comes out of the Sierras here, and it would originally supposed to drain out into the San Francisco Bay, but it's been diverted down through Fresno County and Tulare County and Kern County to feed agriculture and some municipal water supplies. And it brings about 1 million acre-feet of water per year. 1 million acre-feet of water. An acre-feet is, if you had an acre of land and you filled it up with a foot of water, it's a measure of volume. So when we're talking about this much water, we use that metric. So it usually brings 1 million acre-feet of water. In 2014, it delivered 58,000. Usually 1 million, 2015, 58,000. In Tulare County, which is the county I want to focus on today, received none of that water because they were a junior rights holder. So what we begin to see at the beginning of this drought around 2014 and 15 is what farmers usually do, is they turn to the ground. So this chart displays the increase in well drilling permits in 2015. The red line is representing agricultural and dairy wells, which are usually much deeper, and the blue line is showing domestic wells. So we see a 67% increase during these drought conditions because they weren't getting their surface water. And I just want to point out, I took several students from 2015 to 17 out into the valley, and we lived there for 2 summers in Tulare County, talking to people whose water went dry and talking to responders. And we gathered this data from the Tulare County Health Services, and so we had these paper permits that farmers would apply for. And I just want to point out who in 2015, at the beginning of this drought, one of the driest years in the last 2,000 years in California, who it was that was these farmers. So when you fill out the permit, it would say farmers. So the number one is Paramount Farms, drilled 21 wells at the origin of this drought. If you're not familiar with Paramount Farms, if you've seen like wonderful pistachios or that fancy pomegranate drink with the cool bottle, That's Wonderful Farms, and they are owned by this Resnick family of Beverly Hills, which is one of the wealthiest families in the world. And they own a lot of water in Kern County and Tulare County, and have been known to buy up farms just for their water rights, to hold and kind of get involved in the water commodity business, even when people weren't having water come out of their taps. Boston Ranch is owned by J.G. Boswell, who at one point was the largest landowner in the world. The other farmer, number 3, John Hancock Insurance of New York City. We've all heard of that famous farmer, right? The point I'm trying to make here is that it wasn't, because we saw signs in California during this time that that farmers need water, but it really wasn't farmers that were doing all this drilling. It was global finance that was doing it. We don't have in the valley this idea of a family farmer. There are very few of them. It is corporations, and family farms have been turned into managers who answer to like John Hancock Insurance Company. So it's an ongoing story everywhere of the death of the American family farmer. So what emerges here is that the Great California Drought was tied to a global political economy. And particularly one crop influenced this drought, which was the sale of almonds. So during this period of time, there was a booming middle class in India and China that were demanding westernized products, particularly almonds. So you may have noticed in the last 5 years this reconfiguration of the almond, whether it's in your almond milk or almond yogurt, all these different ways the almond is packaged and sold to you. This began to become very popular in China and India as well. And so the price of almonds in Central Valley of California skyrocketed. So we see a lot of farmers turning to change their acreage from maybe something like alfalfa or lettuce to citrus. They're changing it to almonds. So 70% of all almonds grown in California are exported to either China, Spain, or India. So one thing about almonds is they're very water-intensive crops. Here's what an almond orchard looks like. People estimate that it takes 1 gallon of water for 1 almond. So when you eat 1 almond out of the bag, that's 1 gallon of water. They require this type of flooding irrigation. And the thing is they don't seed right away, right? It takes 4 to 5 years to get to this point. So if you're watering, so let's say you started in California, even if you were a family farm, if you started in 2012, if you changed your crop from something else to almonds, you were married to that for 5 years, because you're not getting any of that investment back until they start blossoming flowers and creating nuts, right? So if you, in a wetter period, you married yourself to flood irrigating these almonds, then it gets really dry in 2015. You have to keep watering it though. So what you do is you turn to the ground. It's around this same period that we saw record highs of domestic well failure in Tulare County. So this is the western portion of Tulare County, which I have mapped here. It is often called the epicenter of the Great California Drought because 1,600 personal household wells went dry. Now that's what these black wells represent. Each one of these black dots represents a dry well in 2015 alone. And I've overlaid these points on the industrial deep agricultural wells that was presented in that previous chart. So the darker the color of the square in the background here in these township section and ranges is the higher number of industrial wells. And through using statistics, we've been able to show, me and my students, that there is a spatial autocorrelation between places where there are domestic wells going dry and an increase in industrial wells being dug. So that is to say that it is not random, right? That there's a statistical relationship between areas where industrial wells are drilled and household wells are failing. So I want to focus on this area down here, probably the biggest cluster in this section of southern Tulare County, which is called Porterville. So Porterville has a municipal water supply. It's a town of about 50,000 or so, and it's here. And you can kind of see the borders of Porterville because there wasn't many domestic well failures. So each one of these red dots is a household that failed. Now this town over here, this unincorporated area, is called East Porterville. And it contains maybe about 7,000 to 8,000 people, and had over 1,000 wells go dry between 2015 and 18 alone. So a few things about East Porterville is when I say it's uncorporated, it means it relies on the county, so there is no municipal water supply. This community is about 67% renters. That's going to become important later, so keep that in mind, 67% renters. And 85% work in the fields as agricultural laborers. And through unofficial community outreach through nonprofits in the area, this area is about 35% of the population is undocumented Mexican laborers. When we compare East Porterville to the surrounding area, it has a higher percentage of Hispanic or Latino persons and a higher percentage of people living in poverty than the surrounding area. And it just so happened to be one of the most exposed communities to this great California drought. So now what I would like to do is to take you through the sequence of hazard response and how households coped during the Great California Drought. So in December of 2013, it was recognized that the Central Valley Project, which is that canal I mentioned, was at 5% of its annual deliveries, and there was going to be a massive shortage of water. What I would like to do with this arrow at the bottom is to help us conceptualize time of hazard response. Because we call, in the hazard world, we call a drought a creeping hazard, right? Meaning that it has no clear end and no clear beginning, right? A tornado comes and it creates damage. The next day, you begin rebuilding. But when does a drought end? How many households have to not have water coming out of their tap before you say it's ended, or when does it begin? And so we call this a creeping hazard, or sometimes we call it a slow onset hazard. And so I want to use this arrow at the bottom as a way to conceptualize time, where each dot represents 1 month. So on January of 2014, the governor at the time declares a state of emergency because California was at all-time low in access to water. And when I say all-time low, that's not hyperbole, that is record lows across the state. So here we are in Tulare County, which is completely covered in this dark maroon color, which is exceptional drought conditions. So the entire county was in exceptional drought conditions. In March of 2014, Tulare County recognizes the drought, and they created a drought task force, which I was surprised to learn that none had such existed prior to that point. In 2014, or in June of 2014, so 6 months later, a local nonprofit called the Porterville Area Coordinating Council notified that there was 40 dry wells in East Porterville. And at the time, in June, the county was only reporting that there was 30 dry wells in the entire county. So just to say that again, the county was saying we only have 30 dry wells, but this nonprofit in East Porterville was saying, well, there's 40 in this small community alone. So this is the beginning of a recognition that people weren't reporting when they had dry wells. And this is the beginning of the story. People weren't telling people that they didn't have water. The first action by the county was to place this big tub of water at the fire department where you could go bring buckets of water and fill up to take to your home if you didn't have water. In August of 2014 was the first official response to East Porterville. The county task force began dropping bottled water off at home. So the first way to reduce vulnerability to a drought is to drop off drinking water. So they brought off enough water for 300 homes, and it was gone within 2 hours. So a quick note on where funding for this came from. So we're now 8 months into the drought. So they hadn't mobilized funding to Tulare County yet. So this water was funded through what is called a State Water Board Cleanup and Abatement Fund. And I want to quote here when these funds are available. To provide public agencies with grants for the cleanup or abatement of a condition of pollution when there are no viable, responsible parties available to undertake the work. So if this area is heavily contaminated with nitrates. Nitrates are found in agricultural areas. Wisconsin has a problem with nitrates in our water, where areas of historic agriculture have contaminated the water, and it's particularly vulnerable to young babies. Nitrates in your blood limits your blood's ability to transport oxygen. And so in this area, they have this thing they call blue baby syndrome, where if your baby's drinking the tap water, their skin turns blue because of a lack of oxygen being transported throughout their body. Another pollutant they have here is this thing called 1,2,3-TCP. And this is a chemical that was produced by Dow and Shell agricultural companies from the 1940s to 1990s. And it was so toxic that both companies weren't allowed to dispose of it in any way. And so what they did is they used it as a filler ingredient in chemical pesticides for farmers. So it was illegal for them to dump it anywhere. So they just put it in pesticides that would be used to spray on food. A really dastardly thing to do, right? And so if you fall within a mile of any site that's contaminated by any of these, you could get drinking water drop-off. And this community was so unlucky that all of them were eligible. So they weren't getting this drop-off because they didn't have water. They were getting this drop-off because if there was water coming out of their tap, it would be poison, right? That's why they were able to. You know, at this time, residents began realizing that some people weren't signing up for the water. And so the PC, the nonprofit I mentioned, began putting these signs outside of houses. So if you can't read that on the palm tree there, it says no water, and it has the number 6 written on it, like this. So, you know, when we would go to these households that didn't have water, we'd ask, how did you come to sign up for it? They would say, no, the church did, the PACC, or some lady came to our door, because people were unwilling to fill out paperwork saying they didn't have water in their house. So why might that be? People were afraid because there was rumors going around town that perhaps the county would come take your children if you didn't have water in your home. There were people who were undocumented who feared deportation, or their children were citizens, but they were undocumented and they'd be deported. Their children would be taken. Their house would be red tagged, which means you would fail a safety test, which would be forced from your house. You'd be evicted. Or if your landlord told you that you were a renter, that the landlord was illegally had a house that didn't have water in it, so they'd have to kick you out. So for all of these reasons, but mostly regarding status of undocumented status, people were not reporting that they didn't have dry wells. So this nonprofit stepped in to try to rectify that problem. Now we're in September of 2014, if you look at our little chart here, and the county begins funneling state funding through these 3 nonprofits. Now it's not too important that we know these nonprofits, but what I do want to say is that we're now 9 months into recognition of extreme exceptional drought conditions, and the reason it took so long to mobilize funds is because the county would receive 100% reimbursement if they channeled the funds through nonprofits, and they would only receive 75% reimbursement if they channeled it, if they did the work themselves. So we're 9 months into like hundreds of homes not having water, and they're just trying to find nonprofits so they can get full reimbursement from state funds. November 2014, about 12 months into the drought, a public shower is put up at a local church. A lot of residents like to use this because, again, they work in the field, so they're dirty every day. They're covered in chemicals. However, women did not like using these public showers for obvious reasons. And so this is further evidence that, remember, when we're talking about a hazard, hazards they magnify the most marginalized populations. So who are the most marginalized populations in Tulare County? Agricultural laborers who are undocumented, who are women, right? So we see who suffers the most in time of hazard. It's those people that have historically been most marginalized. And also, to add one more layer to that, the county wanted to get rid of these, even though they weren't paying for it, because they were worried that homeless people were taking showers here. So who's the most vulnerable people? Women, agricultural laborers, who are undocumented, who are homeless, right? So whatever step you can go down of most marginalized population are who these hazards hurt the most. By December of 2014, there were 1,000 dry wells reported in East Porterville and a population of only about 8,000. So this was an informal setup that you would have outside of your house of one of our key informants here. And the daily stress, we talked to probably about 100 people that live there, residents, and inability to clean your clothes, to have your garden die out, to have your grass brown, to not be able to flush the toilet. People would talk about how their homes smell like urine because they have to ration their toilet flushing. Not being able to take a shower for kids that were going to school. It took a psychological effect on the people because we're talking about going 2 to 3 years without drinking water. So that takes a toll on your everyday life. The inability to clean your house, to have to spend more money on paper utensils because you don't wash your dishes. So you're spending extra money. You're already socioeconomically disadvantaged, and you're spending more money because you can't wash your dishes. Jumped ahead a lot there. In December of 2014, the county started a household tank system where it would put one of these tanks in your front yard and it would hook it up, rig it up to your house. And this really alleviated a lot of those problems I just talked about, right? All those problems I just mentioned. However, the county said they could not do this for renters, which remember, in East Porterville is 67% of the population, because they said that the government cannot subsidize private business, and landlords are private businesses, right? The leader of the Office of Emergency Services told me if we were following code by the book, what we would do is we would kick all these people out of their homes, because as a hazard responder, he's used to dealing with fires or earthquakes, and people aren't allowed to go back into their homes until they can get water in it. But here, the hazard itself is not having water in your home. So the idea of kicking people out of their homes and red tagging them didn't make sense to him. But he also said that they couldn't subsidize these renters, because that would be government subsidizing private business. To which I say, well, let's look at some farm subsidies. This was disaster-related farm subsidies in Tulare County during the time, totaling about $32.4 million to those same farms that are John Hancock Insurance, the Resnick family, some of the richest families in the world. So this is another example of what we're seeing continuously more of, is that we have, socialism for the very rich, the very wealthy. We have socialism in America. But for the poor, we have rugged capitalism, right? There's this dichotomy of systems depending on your status. There was a continuing pressure. So like the New York Times and LA Times began writing pieces on what was going on in East Porterville. And so the governor's office was putting increasing pressure on from Porterville to connect East Porterville up to their water system. But the city of Porterville said they could do that, but they'd have to charge each household $5,000. So again, if you're renters, you're not going to pay $5,000 for the hookup. Eventually, East Porterville organized into the East Porterville for Water Justice Coalition, which means my students attend a lot of meetings. And again, through the pressures of the governor's office, they were, after about 4.5 years, able to begin connecting homes up to East Porterville. So in 2016, they began connecting homes in East Porterville. And by February of 2018, they connected 755 homes. So when I say there was a creeping response to a creeping hazard, this is what I'm talking about, right? Over 4 years to begin to rectify this problem for a sustainable solution. So just to wrap things up here, exposure to the Great California Drought was funneled to the most marginalized populations, which is sort of, the introduction that I gave you. I gave you the closing before I started. And if we want to quantify that or qualify that rather, it was women, renters who had young children who were undocumented. Those are the most vulnerable populations. This time period, we saw record agricultural earnings in the Central Valley. And so that is all I have for you today. Thank you. I'll take any questions. Yeah.
There was a slide you had where you showed the time period of the drought, but you also showed, I think, the amount of acres dedicated to almonds.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess my interpretation was that they were planting more almonds in the middle of the drought. Is that correct?
Yes, because per acre you could get more money, but also the story is that they began planting them before the drought,
Okay.
right? Because they are so water intensive, but you might, like I said, it might take 4 to 5 years before they start producing a yield. So even, say if you were the best of intention family farmer, and in 2013 you began planting, you had to, family farms went broke drilling deeper and deeper wells during this time, because if they didn't, they would lose everything, right? So, so yes, it wasn't as if, but still, even today, the major farm owners are still growing almonds because they can access groundwater. So I'd like to say like this changed conditions, but it did not.
So we have one question online, and then I'll get to yours. Alyssa, excuse me if that's not your name pronunciation, sorry. They say, thanks for your presentation. What does this lead you to think about climate resilience, excuse me? Do you expect a lot of climate refugees coming to Wisconsin?
Well, The recent climate change from the IPCC said that these conditions are no longer should be considered exceptional, that the drought conditions in California will increase in severity and frequency. The area of Central Valley is not as populated as the urban coast of California. So I don't think people will be leaving the Central Valley of California, but for the last 4 years, we are seeing an exodus of people from California. I've seen several maps and data showing a movement of people out of California, but I'm not sure if that has is drought related or if that's housing or cost of living changes. So I don't think you'll see an exodus from the Central Valley because of the need for laborers in these communities for the food, but perhaps for other reasons we're seeing an exodus of California for now.
Thank you.
You talked about these corporate farms, like especially the John Hancock farms. Like, are these farms that are owned by people like not even in the state, like completely different parts of the country, and they just own the land?
Yeah, right. So they'll, you know, a lot of these larger corporations will hold land to for future speculation, right? So whether that's speculation on water, because you can control certain aspects of the water when you're in the land, or to sell commodities like almonds. So, you know, John Hancock Insurance, they're not just an insurance company, right? They are engaged in activities all over the world. One of the companies I had mentioned here, Sunworld Farms, they're a subsidiary of a group called Black Capital Management. It's based out of London, and they're a system of hedge funds, and they buy out companies that are going to go bankrupt and fire everyone and resell it and package it. And so, you know, I present it in this manner to say that, you know, there isn't a family farm. They manage them from afar, right? They hire a manager, or when they buy farms, the family that lives there, they say, okay, you're the manager of the farm now. It's not your farm. But there's no one, you know, from John Hancock Insurance Company who, yeah, would ever probably even step foot on the place.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was wondering if getting water from Porterville is sustainable. Like, do they have to worry about their water running out or becoming like harmful to drink?
Yes and yes. But the thing about East Porterville's water is it's, you know, the municipal water also relies on groundwater, but it goes very deep. It goes like 300 feet down into the ground. These household wells, some of them are only 20 feet deep or 30 feet deep. And, you know, farmers can always go deeper. But when you call a driller, if say you wanted to rectify this problem at your property, let's say you even owned your property in East Porterville, and you called a driller to drill a borehole for you, they charge you per foot. And so you pay a lot of money for the driller to come out because they raise their prices during this drought to drill holes. And they say, you know, we'll stop when we hit the water table. And so let's say you're paying per foot, and they're like, okay, we're at 21 feet, no water, 22, and it's going up thousands of dollars, 23. Okay, now you're at 30 feet. Now you're at 31 feet. Okay, now you're at 40 feet. We haven't hit water yet. And so there's people that had well drillers come out, but had to stop them before they even hit water because they were just seeing their life savings, you know, or their credit being damaged. And then they still have to pay the cost for the driller, and they're still not getting water. And so I guess to answer your question, the wells are much deeper, and you know, it's easier for either the city of Porterville or for farmers to dig these 200 to 250 feet wells, which would be not possible for the vast majority of homeowners. Yes, there's nitrates in that water as well, but it goes through a city treatment plant, perhaps. But even there still are chemicals that get through that. All right. Well, thank you for coming today, everyone. We really appreciate it. Thank you.